Take a look at the following mathematical function. It's called the sine function, and it works like this. Sine x, or sine of x, is -1 if x is less than 0. And don't get this confused with the trig function sine. This is completely different. Sine of x is 0 if x is equal to 0, and sine of x is 1 if x is greater than 0. So how can we write this as a C# program? Well, the first thing we could do is write it as a series of if statements. So let's try that. First, we'll create a couple of variables, sine and number. Then we'll ask the user to enter a number, and we'll get that number from the console, as we usually do. Now, here's where we have our series of if statements. If number is less than 0, sine is equal to -1. If number is equal to 0, sine is assigned the value 0. And if number is greater than 0, then sine is assigned the value 1. The problem with this code is that, as I said in the last lesson, we really should not code this as a series of independent if statements, because each if will be evaluated regardless of what the value of number is. So even if number is less than 0 and we assign sine the value -1, we're still going to evaluate number equals 0 and number greater than 0. But what we can do is write it as a series of nested if statements. So let's see how that's going to work. We'll get rid of what we don't need there, and then we'll say else, and then we'll say if number is equal to 0, sine is equal to 0, else sine is equal to +1. Close that else, close that else. Now let's work through the logic before we test the program. And I'll tell you what, let's do. Let's add one more line here. Let's write out the result. Console write sine of number sine. So now let's work through the logic. If the value of number is less than 0, assign the value -1 to sine, and that's all you have to do. If number is not less than 0, then we trigger the else part, and then we say, well, if it's equal to 0, then sine is assigned the value 0, and that's all we have to do, and we can stop. Otherwise, else, if number is not less than 0 and number is not equal to 0, well, then it must be greater than 0. We don't need another if test here. We can just go ahead and assign the value 1 to sine and be done with the function. So now let's run it with a couple of examples. So let's try -10, and the sine of -10 is -1. That's correct. Let's run it again with 0, and that's right. Let's try it one more time with a positive number. We'll just enter 1, and the sine of 1 is 1, and that's right. When you're writing nested if statements like this, the thing you need to be careful about is your indentation. Not because the compiler will get it wrong. The compiler never gets it wrong, but because this will keep you from making mistakes. I've spent lots of time correcting other people's code where they wrote everything flush left and had a bug in their program, and all I had to do was get the indentation correct, and then usually the bug discovered itself almost. It was very easy to discover the bug once we got the code into a decent format. So always indent your code inside nested if statements, and other places as well. We'll talk about those later. One technical point I want to make here is that when you're working with nested ifs and elses, remember that an else always goes with the nearest if, so that this else is assigned to this if, or is attached to this if, and this else goes with this if. As long as you remember that, you'll be less likely to make any mistakes when you code nested if statements. Now, having shown you how to write a nested if statement, in most of the cases that you're going to come across, although not all, what you really want is not nested ifs, but something called an if-else if statement. And we're going to look at that in the next lesson, which begins right now.